Alright, we are back on the warpath, the historical warpath that is, with the English Revolution of 1688, otherwise known as the Glorious Revolution, and sometimes known as the Bloodless Revolution. And I received some assistance from Professor Rabin here at the University of Illinois. With that, I introduce episode 26, A Prelude to the Glorious Revolution.
I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
As I said, this is the prelude to the 1688 English Revolution, but this introduction is not simply an introduction, it is the first chapter of a quite complex and often overlooked time in history. Meaning that this episode will introduce you to the historical context and allow you to understand what is happening, who or what is doing it, and why it was occurring at all. Okay, Europe is a complicated landscape no matter the time period, but 17th century Europe was downright ridiculous. Division, war, and conflict were absolutely everywhere. By the 1680s, the Protestant Reformation had occurred well over a century and a half prior, but you would be mistaken to believe religion was a forgotten issue when King James II of England, Scotland, and Ireland took the crown as a Catholic in 1685. I'll address the European continent and religion more so in a minute, but allow me to explain who James II is. To do that, I am obliged to first give you a quick recap of the 17th century and the British Isles. The first section of this episode is entitled 17th Century Britain, and will address the history during that time and who exactly the Stuarts are. The second section is entitled Europe, and will explain Europe's role. The third section, entitled Religion, will address religion's role, and the fourth and concluding section will take us through the reign of Charles II and up to the accession of James II. So as I begin section 1 on 17th century England, I thought I'd begin with a question that I proposed to Professor Rabin. I asked her this question. So what one word comes to mind when you think of England in the 17th century, and why?
You know, I was thinking about your question, and the word that came to mind was a bit of a mess. But explosive in terms of the ideas that were circulating. I think print is really coming into its own, although you see that so much more in the 18th century. It's more revolutionary in the 17th century.
With that, allow me to explain exactly who James II was. James II was of the House of Stuart, which had ascended to the throne in 1603 after the death of Elizabeth I, who had been, of course, the last of the Tudor dynasty. After King James I came Charles I, the father of our main interest, James II. The problem was Charles I was a poor monarch. Some historians paint him as a terrible tyrant, others as a sympathetic but ignorant leader. The truth is somewhere in between. He was certainly not a terrifying tyrant, but he certainly proved to be a poor leader. Charles lacked the leadership and touch of an Elizabeth, or even the lesser skills of his late father. Thus, by the 1630s, the British Empire under Charles I was beginning to fracture, and after years of uneasiness, it descended into unrest and despondency. This unrest came in many, many forms. But all you need to know is that by the early 1640s, the British Isles, primarily England, were preparing for war, civil war. The two sides that coalesced in the pre-war period were the parliamentarians and the royalists. In 1642, violence broke out, and thus began the English Civil War. After almost a year of bloodshed and both sides holding their own, the parliamentarians under Oliver Cromwell formed the New Model Army. They also secured an alliance with Scotland. This is when the war truly turned against Charles and his royalists. The New Model Army was a smaller army, but a far more potent force, and it relied on what we now consider modern tactics and unit formations. Couple that with the equally exceptional generalship of Cromwell himself and their new Scottish allies, the parliamentarians began to devastate the royalist army. Charles surrendered soon after in 1646, and Parliament took over England thereafter. Well, sort of. It was really Oliver Cromwell that was in charge because he held control of the army. And with that in mind, Charles I was put on trial and soon after executed. His sons Charles II and James II did, however, escape from England into exile. The period that followed Charles's execution is known as the Interregnum. It lasted from 1649 to 1660. Interregnum is an old Latin word that literally means the time between reigns. It was also called this because the Stuart dynasty did reclaim the throne. During the Interregnum, though, England was governed by a commonwealth and then the protectorate. It was a complex time to live in, but to make it more simple, during this time England was run under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell. He was not a king, but he certainly led like one. And hate him or like him, you have to admit that Cromwell knew how to lead. But after his death in 1658, though, his son Richard succeeded him. And Richard lacked the abilities of his father. And the army overpowered him, and Parliament then filled the power vacuum and reconvened in 1660. And the 1660 Parliament turned out to be packed with royalists, and they moved to restore Charles Stuart to the throne. Charles accepted the offer and declared that all in his kingdoms would be granted amnesty for the deeds against his father during the English Civil War. Charles Stuart was then crowned King Charles II in the summer of 1660, and it was also then that James II, his younger brother, returned as well, now the Duke of York. It is essential to remember, though, that Charles II was Protestant, but James was Catholic. This is a pivotal detail in the history of the Glorious Revolution. So, now you understand 17th century England a little bit better, and know who both Charles and James are. Therefore, with all of that out of the way, let me now address the continent. Yes, that brings me to section 2 of this episode, Europe. The Glorious Revolution would be a much simpler event to explain if European power and politics were not involved, but nothing could be further from the truth. The political jockeying in continental Europe is paramount in the tale of the Glorious Revolution. On one side of the continent, the formidable Ottoman Empire stood as an Islamic juggernaut. But more pertinent in this tale were the political, economic, and military moves in Central and Western Europe leading up to 1688. Europe in the 17th century was extremely bloody, and much like England, was racked by warfare. Some of the bloodshed came from religious persecution and religious war. Some from the clashing of empires and kingdoms, some from outright religious wars, and sometimes all of the above. And for this reason, several historians have even labeled the 17th century as a time of, quote, general crisis. Much of this European turmoil began after the Reformation of the 16th century and had simply continued to dominate continental affairs. But that can be better addressed in the next section of this episode. So instead, let me give you examples of how intense the 17th century was. The Spanish Empire ended up fighting 2 or 3 rebellions, with a great amount of violence coming out of the Spanish Netherlands. There was also the Roman Inquisition, and in 1618, the Holy Roman Empire began to self-destruct over the divide between Protestantism and Catholicism. And that is very important because the fighting escalated within the Germanic domains of the Holy Roman Empire, and the 30 Years' War broke out as a result. The 30 Years' War lasted from 1618 to 1648, as you might imagine, and outside of the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburg dynasty, it involved almost every European state in one way or another. This included the Swedish Empire, France, Austria, Bohemia, Spain, the Ottoman Empire, and many more lesser states. Estimates put the death toll of the war, including civilians, at a colossal 6 to 8 million people. The reason I bring the 30 Years' War to your attention, aside from its sheer brutality, is because its conclusion was less than satisfactory for many European states. The war led to the formation of the Dutch Republic in the Netherlands, which is very important to our story, and allowed Protestant leaders in the Germanic kingdoms and domains to freely practice their religion. For some, this was a good conclusion, but for others, it was simply seen as a ceasefire. That is why I mention the 30 Years' War in such detail, because it left the door open for rising European powers to reassert themselves later. These rising powers included France under Louis XIV, Prussia, the Swedish Empire, and to some extent, the Dutch Republic. So it is apparent, in retrospect at least, that another continental war in Europe was brewing soon after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Several lesser wars broke out in the following decades, but by the accession of James II in 1685, another great war was looming due in large part to the audacity of King Louis XIV of France. This war would become known as the 9 Years' War or the War of the Grand Alliance. But here's another important question. What was at the heart of the impending 9 Years' War? Was it religion, as it was during the beginning of the earlier 30 Years' War? I asked Professor Rabin that very question.
I don't think so. I think religion by the end of the 30 Years' War, just the 30 Years' War takes all religion out of religion. The brutality of that war, the lifeblood, especially in Central Europe, it was awful, and the loss of life. And so the idea that you would fight over religion I think people have a very different attitude after the 30 Years' War is resolved. So I think it's more about power.
So it is abundantly clear that the 9 Years' War was about power. But why am I telling you all this? Well, I do so because when the war breaks out in 1688, England and its revolution will be right in the thick of it, and soon you shall learn why. Before any of that can happen, though, it's time for Section 3, Religion. The primary reason I have this section is because James II is Catholic, and the Protestant people of England do not like that. They, in fact, hate that. So why? Why are certain kingdoms and places in Europe Protestant, and why are others Catholic, and why is there such animosity between the two sects of Christianity? That is far too large of a question to fully answer right now, but I will try and shed some light on how the Christian schism affects England and the occurrence of the Glorious Revolution. To do that, I regrettably have to wind the clock back to the early 16th century, to the beginning of the Reformation itself. As a preface, I want to note that the Roman Catholic Church had not held supreme control over all Christendom before 1517, but they had held by far the most control. And that brings me to Martin Luther. And when Luther nailed his 95 Theses on a church door in Germany, however, all hell broke loose in Europe. Luther and his followers ushered in the Protestant Reformation that sought to expose the Roman Catholic Church as a corrupt entity that was misleading good Christians. It's super complicated, but basically, Christianity fractured in a massive way. Speeding up a few years to the late 1520s, and England is drawn into the Protestant Reformation, and they are forced into the situation by King Henry VIII, of the House of Tudor. Henry VIII is now infamous for his 6 wives, and the fact that he beheaded 2 of them. However, the only marriage we need to care about at the moment is his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon. After almost 20 years of marriage, she had failed to give him a male heir, and Henry feared that if he did not leave a clear male successor, that it would be an affront to God and lead to the downfall of the Tudor dynasty. With that in mind, Henry made a request to the Pope to annul his marriage. For several reasons, the Pope simply could not grant this. The first reason being the fact that marriages were only allowed to be annulled, according to canonical law, if it had not been consummated. But everyone in Europe knew that it had been consummated. But let's be realistic. That wasn't the real reason the Pope and the Church denied Henry VIII. After all, the Catholic Church had a large reputation for corruption. A well-earned reputation, I might add. The real reason was because Charles V, the King of Spain, leader of the Habsburgs and the Holy Roman Emperor, controlled Italy and was the nephew of Catherine. So fearing repercussions, the Pope denied Henry VIII. Henry VIII, being a prideful man, did not let that deter him. He looked for a way around the Pope and the bindings of the Church in Rome. Therefore, in 1529, Henry summoned Parliament to find a way to legally annul his marriage. This has become known as the Reformation Parliament because, after much deliberation, their answer to Henry's demand was that England should initiate their own Reformation and break from the Catholic Church. At first, Henry was hesitant because he was truly a very devout Catholic. It is said that he even attended Mass 4 or 5 times a day. He eventually decided to overlook his devotion, though, because he saw the advantages such an act would give him, meaning Henry realized how much more power he could have as the leader of his own church. With that in mind, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy in 1534, founding the Church of England with King Henry VIII at the head of the new Anglican Church. Officially, he was known as the supreme head of the Church of England, and the monarchy continues to lead the Anglican Church today. So finally, after many years, Henry was able to officially rid himself of Catherine of Aragon, initiating the English Reformation in the process. Now, Henry VIII's reasoning may have been mundane, but the consequences of the English Reformation are essential to understanding how and why the Glorious Revolution happened. Its primary consequence was, of course, that it made England a Protestant kingdom. In the years and decades after the English Reformation, this really meant very little, though, because the Anglican Church was very, very similar to the Catholic Church. To this day, that remains a fairly accurate assessment. Yet, by the 17th century, the English Reformation had major consequences as Protestantism took hold strongly amongst the people. This even led to the formation of many more radical Protestant sects like the Puritans within the British Isles. The second consequence was quite unintended. The English Reformation, in an abstract way, helped the rise of Parliament because it was Parliament that created the Church and granted the monarchy their new powers. That is important because political entities rarely ever give up powers, and Parliament had gained a new legislative authority, an authority that they asserted under Charles I, and an authority that they would reassert during the reign of James II. Now, aside from those consequences, I told you the short tale of the English Reformation so you could properly understand the religious tension that existed between Protestants and Catholics when James II became king in 1685. And with that understanding, you can hopefully comprehend why it was so disturbing to allow a Catholic king to rule a Protestant people during this time period, especially when a Catholic English monarch is the supreme head of the Protestant Church of England. So that brings me to Section 4, the reign of Charles II and the crowning of a Catholic king. Charles turned out to be a much better leader than his father, not perfect by any means, but a capable monarch. I'll begin in the early 1670s. 1672 to be exact, when Charles II tried to pass a declaration of indulgence that would have granted Catholics and Protestant dissenters the right to freely practice their religion. Parliament and the people did not really mind the Protestant dissenters, but they were absolutely opposed to allowing Catholicism back into their kingdoms, legally that is. The people were also afraid that if Catholicism was allowed free reign again, then they, the Catholics, would begin persecuting Protestants, exactly like what had happened to French Protestants under Louis XIV and what had happened to German Protestants in the Holy Roman Empire during the 30 Years' War. With this swelling of opposition and fear, Parliament opposed the motion by the king, and Charles wisely backed down from his proposal of a declaration of indulgence. If we speed up to 1678, things begin to get interesting once more in Britain. The choices Charles made in the last 7 years of his reign are pivotal landmarks in understanding the uprising against his brother James. After Charles's attempt at a declaration of indulgence, the Houses of Parliament lost a lot of trust in Charles. There were rumors that he was a Catholic sympathizer, and none of this was helped by the fact that his brother James was Catholic. To try and soothe the situation, Charles married his brother James's daughter Mary to William, the Prince of Orange. William was also a key leader of the Dutch Republic, a stout Protestant, and is a very key player in the Glorious Revolution. After all, I'm fairly certain you are familiar with the two names William and Mary when they are put together. So this alliance very much pleased Parliament and many in Britain, especially considering William of Orange was also the grandson of King Charles I. This balance of power between the king, Parliament, and the people was not to last for long, however, because of the actions of another monarch. I speak of King Louis XIV of France, who by 1678-79 was reaching the zenith of his powers. But the great Sun King, as he was known, eyed more gains. More specifically, King Louis had his eyes on territory in the Dutch Republic and the Holy Roman Empire. As mentioned before, this impending war would become the 9 Years' War, but while the war itself was years away, the tension between the European peoples and powers was palpable. Due to this, the history between 1678 and 1680 is very complicated and hard to understand because there was a lot of backdoor dealings, treaties, and talks that occurred. For example, in 1679 there were conspiracies that King Charles was debating a conversion to Catholicism and in alliance talks with King Louis XIV. It was also said that Charles was eliminating top English officials that opposed his policies. Most of these rumors were falsified, but there were kernels of truth in these stories. Allow me to explain. The truth is, several officials across the British Isles had been executed in 1678-79 on false accusations. These victims had been accused of everything from seditious libel and treason all the way to witchcraft. Yes, indeed, witchcraft was still very much a real quote-unquote threat at this time. Also, I feel that I should explain exactly what seditious libel is during this time period for those who don't know, because in our modern world we don't see it too much. Seditious libel is essentially speaking out against your government in whatever form without the written consent of the government. I'll leave it at that because seditious libel will pop back up in this story. The whole conspiracy around these executions was not the king's fault, but nonetheless it garnered him no favors in his kingdoms. As for Charles II's Catholic sympathies and the supposed talks with France, both of these were actually very true. The rumors across Britain at the time and running through Parliament were very inaccurate, but still surprisingly very true. I'll cut to the chase on this complicated set of affairs. Charles and King Louis XIV began to have talks circa 1679-80 that essentially amounted to a neutrality agreement. The documents are very sketchy about this event, but it's entirely believable that this could have happened because in 1670, Charles had signed the secret Treaty of Dover with King Louis with the intent that France would help England become Catholic again in exchange for a war alliance. I'm going to pause right there for a moment to let that sink in. King Charles II, at least at some point, intended for his kingdoms to become part of the Catholic Church again. So his Catholic sympathies were not just rumors, they were based in reality. And I once again mentioned King Louis XIV again there, but I have yet to explain how the English thought of him. Which is why I asked Professor Rabin how the English viewed the French, and more specifically what exactly had King Louis XIV become in the eyes of the English.
Well, he becomes the negative example, right? He did that so well because he was so good at being Louis XIV, and he had such great iconography and such great PR. And so English people, I think it didn't take much for them to be able to think of him as the opposite, the other. And they already had this fraught relationship with France. Right. So that also made it easy to define them as exactly what we are not.
And with that in mind, it is no surprise that the public opinion in the British Isles hated France at this time, and Charles had the gall to broker an alliance with the most detested monarch in Europe. That is the definition of dangerous politics. But then again, if King Louis succeeded in his designs, Charles's decision would have seemed very wise. Nevertheless, this is why Parliament and the English in general distrusted Charles, and another reason why there was so much anti-Catholic sentiment around the 1680s. As proof of Parliament's distrust, they proposed the Exclusion Bill. If passed, the bill would have excluded Catholics from high office. The entire reason for this is because Parliament and much of England at large did not want James, Charles's openly Catholic brother, remember, to become king. To the English, Charles II was bad enough with what he was doing with France, but the idea of a Catholic monarch brought the fear that if James was made king, he would persecute their Protestant religious beliefs like King Louis XIV, or at the very least threaten their livelihoods. To make it more clear, to the British at this time, the idea of having a Catholic king is akin to having a communist serve in the U.S. government during the Cold War. That's how intense this issue really was. That being the case, everyone overwhelmingly clamored for the Exclusion Bill to be passed and ratified. So what did Charles II do? He simply dissolved Parliament. That was not the first time it had ever happened, but the last time the power struggle between Parliament and the Crown had got this intense was just before the English Civil War. This all happened in 1679. King Charles attempted to reinstate the Parliament 3 more times in the next 2 years, but every time they attempted to pass the Exclusion Bill. So in 1681, after just a few days of talks, King Charles dissolved Parliament for the 4th and final time. For the next 4 years until his death, King Charles II ruled without Parliament and in relative stability. King Charles II died on February 6, 1685, and despite his struggles and disputes with Parliament and many of his officials, he's remembered as a capable leader and a good king. The next day, his brother was crowned King James II. For many, their worst fears had been realized. They were being led by a Catholic king. That concludes this prelude to the Glorious Revolution. I thank Professor Rabin for her assistance, and ask you to keep an eye out for the book she is currently working on. If you liked what you heard, make sure to rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes. I'll also be releasing a short announcement soon. As always, if you have any questions, send them to everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you very much.